Over the last decade, 4A Games has built a reputation for pushing technology to new heights. From the original Metro 2033 and its high-end visual features that stretched PCs of the era to their limits, to last year's Metro Exodus, which delivers a highly detailed open world while introducing real-time ray-traced global illumination on the PC. The in-house 4A engine is certainly remarkable. But between these releases, the team developed remastered versions of its first two Metro games, Metro 2033 and Last Light, for current generation consoles. Metro Redux, as it was known, delivered a solid 60 frames per second experience on both PS4 and Xbox One with impressive visuals for an early generation game. Now as we approach the end of the generation, Redux has re-emerged, this time on a portable console, the Nintendo Switch. While we've become used to rather ambitious ports on Nintendo's console, I never get tired of seeing once cutting-edge visuals make the jump into the portable realm. So, how does it stack up? That's exactly what we're here to examine. We'll check out the game running on Switch while comparing it against both the original and Redux versions of Metro. What was sacrificed in bringing the game to Nintendo Switch? And are there any issues with input latency or performance? Let's find out. For the unfamiliar, the first two Metro games are first-person shooters set deep within the radiation-ravaged Metro system beneath Moscow. With limited supplies, players make their way through the underground, and occasionally above ground, while dealing with a wide range of enemies. Stealth, combat, and storytelling are all part of the experience, with both games offering a unique atmosphere quite unlike any other game on the market. This new release then is the first time Metro has appeared on a Nintendo platform, and the first time it has been released on what is essentially mobile hardware. And one of the first points of interest centers on its developer. Typically, conversions to Switch are handled by third-party companies. Developers such as Panic Button and Feral Interactive have developed a strong reputation for their excellent work, but not all Switch ports are created equal. With Metro Redux, the game was ported to Switch by 4A Games itself. That's right, this is an in-house port, not something you typically see when an older release is brought forward to a new platform. As the name implies, this is indeed the Redux version of Metro, so let's do a little comparison here with the original Xbox 360 versions of the game. As you can see, the differences are obvious. Redux offers improved textures and models, a new lighting model, and more detail all around. In addition, many sequences have been modified. While it's true that there are similar first-person animation sequences which are useful for direct comparison, a lot of scenes have been modified. The third-person cutscenes have all been replaced with new first-person animations. We've discussed all this in the past comparing Redux to the original, but this just reiterates that this is indeed the enhanced version of 2033 we have on Switch, which makes a lot of sense, of course. The same is true of Last Light. The original version was already improved over 2033, but Redux makes further tweaks and changes. I think it's interesting to see how it stacks up against the original 360 version as well. And this is without touching on performance. The first two Metro games drop frames and exhibit screen tearing like crazy on Xbox 360, while the Switch version, well, you'll see later. So we've established that this is indeed the Redux version. So what has changed between the other console versions and this new Switch port? Firstly, like many other games in the system, Metro Redux uses the lowest level NVN API available to developers as opposed to Vulkan or OpenGL. This low-level API allows the developers to get the most out of the portable hardware. In bringing the game to Switch, there are primarily three areas where visuals have been sacrificed to run on this system then: image quality, performance, and texture quality. The question is, how stark are the differences and what has really changed here? Let's begin with image quality. Metro on the Switch presents an interesting case. You see, a lot has changed since the original release on PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. If you look back at older digital Foundry content from this period, matters of resolution used to be very simple. In the case of Redux, you had a fixed pixel count of 1080p on PS4 and 912p on Xbox One. Both versions use a form of post-process anti-aliasing as well. It was the same story for many games early on this generation: fixed pixel counts and basic post-process AA. It was very easy to understand how the game might look on your display. But in 2020, we're moving into what is effectively the post-resolution era. A simple pixel count no longer tells the whole story. This has been increasingly the case for many recent games over the past few years, but Metro Redux offers a stark comparison due to its earlier release on PS4 and Xbox One. It's likely that the Switch lacks the hardware muscle to push a full 1080p pixel count, and simply running at a lower resolution with just FXAA would produce a messy, aliased image. The solution then is temporal super resolution, which seeks to achieve clean edges while minimizing artifacts. If you count pixels, the effective resolution seems to hang around 1280 by 720, but just saying it's 720p doesn't really tell the whole story, as there's a lot of variables that can lead to image quality both above and below this threshold depending on what's happening. That said, there's only so much you can do with the lower overall pixel count. It's very clearly lower resolution than the PS4 version, and fast-moving objects can break up somewhat. Alpha buffers also appear to deliver quarter resolution output, roughly, so flames appear rather chunky on Switch, whereas they're nice and smooth on PS4. Still, this type of image reconstruction is becoming increasingly common to the point where we're examining potential avenues to better present this data in the future of Digital Foundry. We're looking into ways to better visualize the difference so you can actually see how much of a difference it makes between different versions of a game. That's the goal, at least. For now, though, know that image quality is generally less sharp than PS4 or Xbox One, but aliasing is kept to a minimum. It's a very clean game, just a little blurry at times. That's just in docked mode, however. Portable mode is perhaps more interesting. You see, like docked, the primary pixel count comes in at 720p, which is kind of rare on the Switch, honestly. But due to the same reconstruction techniques, it winds up looking extremely clean and sharp on Switch's internal LCD. Image quality is just superb and much cleaner than many other comparable titles such as Wolfenstein 2, which often dipped below the 720p mark, as low as 360p in some cases. It's really one of the best Switch games for portable mode play, at least in terms of image quality. Compared to docked mode though, it is possible for the pixel count to drop a little more often, with results coming in around 480p as opposed to 720p, but these moments are relatively uncommon and difficult to spot. Thus, I feel that portable mode simply looks better overall. It's really clean and sharp on the Switch screen, but it does have some drawbacks, namely the darkness. You see, Metro is a very dark game that relies on a lot of deep shadows and empty black space to increase atmosphere. It looks nice on a CRT monitor or an OLED TV, of course, but the Switch uses a mediocre LCD panel and the backlight glow is painfully obvious, making it look somewhat less impressive and it's more difficult to see. This isn't really the kind of game you want to play in a brightly lit room or on a train. So it's an interesting situation then, as the portable mode looks so darn good, but the game itself isn't always well suited to that sort of gameplay. But beyond image quality, you might wonder what else has changed, if anything. Well, in terms of visual detail, the Switch version compares very favorably to the PlayStation 4 release of the game. We've already seen plenty of comparisons thus far, but the gist here is that nearly everything has been carried over 1-to-1. The primary difference I noticed when looking closely though is a loss in texture detail in specific areas. Look at the surface here, you can see what I'm talking about. It's also evident in this scene if you look closely. But in many other scenes the textures appear identical or nearly identical, so it's very hit or miss. I also noticed a couple minor visual glitches, such as this light corona in the elevator sort of clipping through the elevator door while it's occluded on the PS4 version. Still, despite the slight drop in texture quality, the overall presentation quality is exceptional. This port stands alongside something like Alien Isolation in that it almost perfectly transplants the full-fat console experience to this portable platform. But Metro has another advantage over Alien even, and that is input latency, or rather the lack thereof. You see, when latency is an issue, I try to make mention of it whenever possible, but in the case of Metro, the situation is reversed to the point where it also warrants mention. This is an extremely responsive game, far more so than I would have expected in fact. Even though the game is capped at just 30 frames per second, the team has managed to perfectly tweak the analog stick dead zone and sensitivity while ensuring fast input response. It feels extremely nice to control, especially on the Pro controller, though the Joy-Con work well too. Metro also supports full 5.1 surround sound audio, a feature that is often missing in Switch games. Here, the game makes active use of all surround sound channels, just like other versions of the game. The quality of the audio itself is also top-notch without any significant compression. I'm looking at the digital download version of the game here, but Metro Redux is also being released on cartridge, a 16GB cartridge to be specific, which supposedly contains both games in full, complete with high-quality audio. The fact that both of them are present on this card without serious audio degradation is a great thing indeed. Of course, without the cartridge in hand, I can't be 100% certain that this is the case, but it certainly seems that way. Then of course we come to performance, which is the third major area where sacrifices had to be made. On PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, Metro Redux runs at 60 frames per second, and both maintain that performance very well. It is an extremely fluid, stable game, and made quite an impression when this first released early on in the console generation, especially on the heels of things like Tomb Raider the Definitive Edition, which really struggled to get there. Now on Switch, the frame rate has been dropped to just 30 frames per second, but it's kind of an expected sacrifice. It's the same story as various other id Tech 6 games that were ported by Panic Button. Those titles were 60 FPS on the original consoles, but capped at 30 on Switch. There's a difference with this one, however, that being the performance is extremely consistent. Starting with Metro 2033, I ran a full hour of gameplay through our tools and determined that the frame rate has been locked to 30 frames per second throughout, with only 1 or 2 rare missed frames or spikes. That means you get a completely even frame persistence here, with each frame appearing 33 milliseconds apart. So locked performance with perfect frame pacing basically. And it's the same story with Metro Last Light, at least overall. I noted one moment where a frame or two came in at 16 milliseconds instead of 33, but again, this is extremely uncommon. Now, I've only had a chance to play through the first hours or so of these games, so I can't speak for the games as a whole, but what I have played is basically perfect. From my perspective, this part of the video is perhaps the least interesting then, as there just isn't much to talk about, but at the same time, it's great for potential buyers of the game. It may not be 60 FPS, but it's extremely consistent. The same is true of portable mode, by the way, which also turns in a stable frame rate, at least most of the time. During the introduction sequence to Metro 2033 out here, I did notice a moment when the game hitched, resulting in a visible skip, but it cleared up quickly and was during a cutscene anyway. Aside from these moments, frame pacing and persistence is excellent. Compared to other first-person shooter conversions out there then, Metro Redux is perhaps the best we've seen yet. The consistency and fast input response make for a very responsive and enjoyable experience overall. But there is one more area to discuss, and it's here where the Switch version starts to suffer, at least a bit. Loading times. The Metro games have always been known for extremely rapid loading times, at least the first two titles anyway. Between areas, you'd wait just a few seconds before the game is ready and you continue on your way. With Metro Redux on Switch, however, the result is mixed. You see, in some cases, loading is slower than PS4, but still very reasonable and ultimately not a huge issue. But then in certain other situations, it can take dramatically more time than any other version of the game. In this case, I had installed the game to the SD card, which is slightly slower than any other method, so you may see subtle improvements when using the internal memory or the game card itself. On the bright side, loading upon death is extremely quick, which removes any potential frustration once you're playing the game. I wouldn't say these loading times are a deal breaker, but it is something to be aware of if you pick up the game. It is worth noting that the minute-plus long loading time that we just looked at, however, was in fact the worst-case scenario that I found during my testing. But after testing it multiple times, it did occur each time. So looking at the package as a whole then, things are mostly positive. The visual quality is comparable to earlier releases of Metro Redux, while the average pixel count is higher than many other comparable conversions such as Wolfenstein 2 or Doom 2016. The frame rate is cut in half, of course, but it's very consistent and input latency is extremely low, so it feels great to play, which is key. Loading times really are the only major issue that I encountered during testing, and even that is variable depending on the stage. So from a technical standpoint, this is an excellent conversion. 4A Games has done a wonderful job at bringing these two titles to the Switch. Now, as for the games themselves, I want to briefly discuss my feelings after revisiting these titles, specifically after playing Metro Exodus. Unlike Exodus, the gameplay is more linear and tightly scripted within these smaller environments. But the core gameplay loop can be a lot of fun. The stealth, for instance, remains solid. Clearing rooms of enemies and quietly working your way through is as satisfying as ever, but there's also a lot of downtime. The thing to remember is that these first two games were released during the height of the cinematic scripted shooter craze, so you spend a lot of time following NPCs around as they perform actions or engage in conversation, not unlike Call of Duty of that era. Metro Exodus has its fair share of talking heads as well, but it lets the players off the leash more often. The main issue here is that there just isn't a lot to do during the sequences. You're surrounded with sort of an invisible barrier, and you just have to wait for the sequences to complete. This is really the one thing I'd like to see change for whatever 4A Games does next, a game which leans into the atmospheric potential of its world while leaving the characters more on the sidelines. Even still, both games are still interesting and engaging to play through. Once you make it through the rather lengthy introduction sequences, which feature a lot of scripted moments, the gameplay does open up and there are some great sequences throughout. So that's Metro Redux on Switch in a nutshell. We have an excellent conversion of two great looking games that hold up beautifully on Nintendo Switch without dead zone or latency issues. If that sounds like something you're interested in playing, I definitely recommend checking it out. It's one of the best conversions we've seen on the Switch yet. But that's going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, as always, be sure to let us know by liking, subscribing, ringing that notification bell for instant updates from Digital Foundry, and of course, come find us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John signing off.